I would like to introduce the next speaker. Fraser Doherty, thank you for being with us. I mean, it's another perspective and another, I would say, experience. You will see he's very young. He started with 14 years old, selling his, taking the recipes from his grandmother, jam recipes, and selling to markets, small markets, farmer markets, and delicatessen shops. Now he's 25, and his company, SuperJam, is selling his products to 2,000 supermarkets all over the world. He has been awarded like a global student entrepreneur of the year. So I mean, being very young, he has proved that being an entrepreneur and successful entrepreneur is possible. So it's our pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Fraser.
Thank you. Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Fraser Doherty. I'm 25 years old. I come from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I'm the founder of a jam company called SuperJam. And I was very kindly invited along today to share my story with you. And that's the story of how I learned my grandmother's secret jam recipe at the age of 14, and over the past 9 or 10 years have turned her recipes into a company that has since sold millions of jars of jam through thousands of supermarkets around the world. I guess you could say that my adventure as an entrepreneur began at an unusually young age. And in fact, ever since I was a little boy, I was involved in coming up with ideas to try and start my own business. And probably the most harebrained story of all came from when I was about 10. And I visited a chicken farm with my childhood friend. And we convinced the farmer to give us a box of eggs, which we took home to my mum and dad, and explained that we'd had this great business idea that we would keep the eggs warm so they would hatch, and we would start our own chicken farm in the back garden. And as I'm sure you can imagine, my parents weren't very excited about this business plan of turning the garden into a chicken farm, but they let us try, not really expecting that 2 10-year-old boys could find a way of hatching eggs. And so we put a box of eggs on top of the TV, where it was kind of warm. And amazingly, a few weeks later, 4 of the eggs hatched into little chickens. And I mean, the poor things probably thought that Jerry Springer was their mum, you know, but we raised them in the house, and we gave them names, and soon we put them out into the garden, and they started laying eggs, which we sold to the neighbors. So that was my first ever little business at the age of 10. Unfortunately, though, my career as a chicken farmer was sadly ended one afternoon when the local fox decided to eat my chickens for dinner. And as tragic and upsetting as that day was, it didn't put me off completely, and I continued to come up with more and more ideas to try and start my own business. And so one afternoon, when I was 14 years old, I was visiting my grandmother, and she was making jam in her kitchen, just in the same way as she had for as long as I can remember. And that's a picture of my gran there. She's the one in the middle. And I got really excited about it, and I asked my gran to teach me how to make jam. We spent the afternoon making a few jars together, and the same day I ran around to the supermarket and I bought some fruit and made a few jars of my own. And before they'd even cooled down, I took them around the neighborhood and asked the neighbors what they thought. And thankfully, the neighbors at least told me that they enjoyed the first few jars of jam that I had ever made, and asked if they could start buying it from me every couple of weeks. And so I was soon making deliveries out of a little plastic bucket, door to door, all over the local area. After a while, the local newspaper heard about this story of a young guy taking his grand's jam recipes and making little business out of them. And that's an article from page 3 of the Edinburgh Evening News from when I was about 15, which I guess probably just meant there wasn't very much happening in town that day for something like that to make it into the news. But following the excitement of being written about in the paper, I decided to leave school, and I started working full-time on trying to turn my jam-making hobby into my career. And so I soon found myself cooking jam all day, every day, in my parents' little kitchen, cooking up to 1,000 jars of jam a week and selling them at farmers' markets all over Scotland. Soon it got to the point my parents couldn't get into the kitchen to cook the dinner anymore, and I realized I was going to have to come up with some kind of big idea to move production into a factory. And so I started doing lots of research, and I found out that sales of jam have unfortunately been in decline for maybe 20 years because jam is very unhealthy, usually about 70% sugar. And I guess when I looked at the other brands of jam on the supermarket shelves, I figured they were very traditional, nothing had changed for a very long time, a little bit boring, and I just thought maybe I could come up with a healthier and more modern and more fun brand of jam. And so hundreds of batches and lots of recipes later in my parents' kitchen, I came up with a way of making jam 100% from fruit, without adding any sugar or anything artificial. I soon had some flavors that I thought tasted pretty nice, and probably quite naively decided I was going to try and sell them to the big supermarkets. And that was something that a teenager had never done before, but I got my big break, I guess, when I got my chance to pitch my idea to Waitrose, one of the supermarkets in the UK. And they hold Meet the Buyer days, which I like to describe as the X factor of selling groceries to supermarkets. And hundreds of people show up and stand in a queue holding their homemade cakes and soups and sauces, and everybody gets 10 minutes to pitch their idea, in my case, to the senior jam buyer of Waitrose. And he said it was a great idea. He said it was a lot of fun to see this kid turning up with his dad's suit on, probably 2 sizes too big for me. But he explained there was a long way to go until I would ever have a product I could sell to a supermarket. I'd have to set up production in a factory and get labels designed and offer a good price. But he promised that if I could do all of that, I'd be welcome to go back, maybe in a year's time, and he'd think about giving it a shot. So having met with the supermarket, it became my dream to one day see my products on their shelves. And I began by trying to create the SuperJam brand, the design of the labels and the website and everything else. And working with some local designers, we figured that there was a link between SuperJam and Superman, or so we thought, and decided to create a brand around a comic book theme. And we had a lot of fun writing jokes on the labels and on the lids, and we even spoke about making a superhero costume for me, the Jam Boy, to wear at the launch of the whole thing, which I was quite looking forward to. So we then had this set of labels that I thought looked pretty cool, and definitely my teenage friends thought were very funny. And I began trying to solve the problem of how to produce hundreds of thousands of jars of jam to sell to the big supermarkets. And obviously, at 17 years old, I wasn't going to be able to build my own jam factory. I was going to have to convince an existing manufacturer to work with me to make my recipes on a big scale. So I traveled around the country from the tiny little islands in Scotland to the big cities in England, trying to find somebody with a jam factory who was willing to work with me. And as I'm sure you can imagine, most of these 100-year-old, very traditional family businesses were a bit skeptical of a 17-year-old kid turning up with no money and no experience and no idea how factories worked and no idea how supermarkets worked. But eventually, I found one factory who had suffered from jam sales falling. They had some spare capacity, and they figured maybe my idea was worth a shot. So a few months later, we figured out how to produce my recipes on a big scale, and I figured I was ready to start supplying supermarkets. The supermarket didn't agree. They explained to me the fact that SuperJam was made 100% from fruit and was all natural had all been lost in all the jokes and humor on the comic book labels. They said the factory I chose was way too expensive, and they didn't even like the flavors I'd made. So basically everything that I just spent a year working on had to be thrown in the bin, and I started all over again. So I traveled around a bit more and eventually convinced a new factory to work with me. The designers and I sat down and had a really good think about what the label should look like. And I guess we asked ourselves, who was going to buy this SuperJam? And we clarified to ourselves that it wasn't kids and teenagers and my friends who might have thought the comic book idea was funny, but it'd be adults. And we'd have to communicate really simply that SuperJam was 100% fruit. So having thought about that, I started to look for inspiration from other brands that I thought had good packaging. And something that I've been amazed by on my whole journey has been how happy other companies and other entrepreneurs have been to share what they've learned with me. And one company was called Method, and they make cleaning products in America. And I have to say, it was the only time I've ever been interested in cleaning products. But they took a product that normally is so ugly, so badly designed, that people don't even think about it. They just hide it away under the kitchen sink. But they created packaging that, in its own kind of way, was beautiful, and were able to be a huge success because of their great packaging. So I got some ideas from them. Another brand was called Dorset Cereals, and they have really simple packaging. They kind of just say what needs to be said. They only use maybe a couple of colors. And actually, by being so simple, they're able to stand out compared to the really noisy, colorful brands like Kellogg's Corn Flakes beside them on the shelf. But the brand that I was most inspired by was called Innocent, and you might have tried some of their juices and smoothies. I wrote to those guys and asked for some advice, and they told me everything they'd learned about packaging design. One thing they told me was that they figured too many people try and say, here are 10 reasons why you should buy my product, and list them all on their packaging. But they just figured, if you could come up with one good reason why someone should buy your product, and put all of your design and all of your energy into trying to get one message across, then maybe when someone spends half a second in the supermarket looking at your product, they'll get your message, and maybe if they get your message, they'll buy your product. And so having taken on board that advice, I realized all we had to do was get this message of 100% fruit across. And so we went through a few different designs that didn't work at all, until eventually came up with one that hopefully does. And the packaging's really simple, really modern, very different to the comic book idea, and very different to the traditional jam packaging I showed you at the start. And thankfully, after all of that, Waitrose agreed. And they launched SuperJam in all of their 300 supermarkets all over the UK about 7 years ago now. And that, of course, meant we had to do the first production run in the factory, which was really exciting and quite an emotional day. I think we made something like 50,000 jars of jam on the first day. And when SuperJam launched in the supermarket, there was a huge amount of media coverage, and I had no idea that this was going to happen, but I found myself being written about in newspapers and magazines and interviewed on TV, and I guess to try and take advantage of all of this media coverage, I decided to go on a rock and roll style tour around all the supermarkets. Handing out samples and signing jars of jam and telling people all about my gran and my story. And I think on the first day, in one store in Edinburgh, where I come from, they sold more than 1,500 jars of SuperJam in one day, which was more jam than they would normally sell in a whole month. They'd never seen anything like it. And I think it got to the point where if anybody tried to go through the checkout without any SuperJam, the person working on the checkout would check they hadn't forgotten. And so then we had a big party when we sold the millionth jar. We launched in Tesco and Asda and Sainsbury's and Morrison's and a couple thousand supermarkets. I got invited to have dinner with the Prime Minister at Downing Street when he heard about it, which was kind of cool. The products got put into the National Museum of Scotland as an example of an iconic Scottish brand, alongside Iron Brew and Baxter Soup and Tunnocks tea cakes. My story was used to advertise mobile phones and in a TV advert for a business card company. But probably the biggest promotion that we ever did was we gave away a free jar of SuperJam to every reader of the Sun newspaper. And I think about 5.5 million people read the Sun every day. It's the biggest newspaper in the English-speaking world. And so my proudest moment of all, as a Scottish person, was being able to share the front page of the Sun with Scotland's national icon, Susan Boyle. Another particular highlight of mine was making my debut on QVC, the home TV shopping channel. And I go on there and tell a story, and people phone up and buy jam from their TV. And that's been a huge success. We're getting ready soon to have an hour-long SuperJam show. And we're also going to be launching on QVC in America, which is really exciting. I guess we've launched SuperJam in countries as far away from home as Australia, in countries as unusual as Russia. And when we recently launched in Japan, my life story was made into a dramatized TV reenactment in which I was played by a small Indian boy. I guess we had some success at getting into lots of big supermarket stores, but I wanted to try and find a way of getting into lots of little tiny stores, and I wasn't too sure how to do that, so we just put a page on the website and asked people who were already buying our products to maybe tell us about a shop in their neighborhood that they thought could sell our products. And it's a really simple idea, but anybody who suggests an idea of a shop, and if that shop places an order, then we send the person who suggested it some free jam to say thank you. And because of that page, we got thousands of suggestions of little shops all over the world, and that really helped us to grow. I guess we became the first jam company in the world to launch an iPhone app with recipes and videos and other bits and pieces. We're about to launch a range of jams for children without any seeds, because kids don't like seeds, and with cute packaging and little jokes for kids and little projects for them to do with the empty jars. We're about to launch some marmalades and all kinds of gifts for Mother's Day and Father's Day and Christmas and Pancake Day. But something I'm really excited about is setting up a honey business, which you can probably guess is called Super Honey, which was inspired by an experience that I had as a kid, where one of our neighbors had some beehives in his garden, and he taught me how to keep bees. I thought as a kid they were fascinating, and I just figured that was an experience that maybe other kids would like to have. And so we've set up beehives in community gardens all over the UK, and we're partnering experienced beekeepers with groups of kids to teach kids about beekeeping and teach them about the environment, and also, of course, to provide homes for millions of bees who I'm sure you all know are having a hard time. And then we sell the honey that the bees make. And for me, this idea of trying to run a business in a way that does more than just makes money, that hopefully does some good, was inspired when I read about an American ice cream company called Ben & Jerry's when I was a kid. And Ben & Jerry were kind of hippies, they were pioneers of fair trade, and a few months ago I got to meet my hero, Jerry, and he ended up sending me to Uganda in Africa, where I got to live with a family who were producing fair trade vanilla to sell for the ice cream. And I also got to meet some beekeepers there who had made some really simple beehives, and that got me working on a project to try and set up an opportunity for families, like the one that I stayed with, to produce honey and sell it fair trade to the UK. So that's pretty cool. We're about to launch SuperJam in America, which has meant we've had to make lots of changes. We translate everything from English into American. And of course, we've had to put the jam in a bigger jar. SuperJam has gratefully received a number of awards along the way, but something that I'm really excited about and ambitious for has been setting up a charity. And to give you a bit of background, when my grandmother originally made jam, she would make jam and scones and cakes, and she'd visit all the elderly people in her area who were maybe living on their own and they were a little lonely, and she would drag my little brother and I with her at the weekends, and he'd play his guitar and I'd tell them stories, and it's just something that my gran felt strongly about. And so I thought it would be nice to try and do something like that on a big scale. And a couple of years ago, we started running free tea parties in community centres and hospitals, originally in Scotland, but we now have them all over the UK. We have them in Australia, around Scandinavia, and it's really just a chance for elderly people to get out of the house and make some new friends. And we've had more than 100 tea parties in the past year. The biggest ones have as many as 600 elderly people at them, so thousands of people have come along and hopefully had a nice time. As part of the Tea Parties project, we have a Tea Cozy of the Week competition, where the elderly people knit tea cozies to go on the teapots, and we feature a different one on the blog every week. This one is a mouse. We've even had a Jesus tea cozy sent in from America. It's kind of fun. I guess to try and raise some money for the tea parties, a year or so ago, my grandmother and I decided to share our jam-making secrets with the world by publishing a cookbook all about how to make jam without adding sugar and how to make traditional British puddings that have jam in them. And when we launched the book, we had a big party to thank everybody who had helped to make everything possible. I've also written a book called Super Business, which is all about my story and all the lessons I've learned along the way and the advice that people have given me. The books have gone on to sell almost 100,000 copies now, which has raised a lot of money for the tea parties. And they've also gone on to be published in Korean and Chinese and Japanese. I have no idea what they say. But my gran and I would never have imagined that an afternoon spent making jam 10 years ago would be translated into Japanese. And I guess that's kind of my story. And maybe what my story shows is that something that can begin as a very simple idea for anybody in a kitchen or a bedroom or a garage, with a bit of love and imagination and hard work, can grow into something amazing, can grow into something that changes your life. I know that SuperJam has certainly changed mine. Can grow into something that gives you a career and hopefully a chance to give back to your community. I guess there's a number of people that I need to thank for making my story possible, not least, of course, my grandmother for teaching me how to make jam in the first place and inspiring the work that I do with the elderly. She's thankfully unaware of her intellectual property rights, but she does get a lot of free jam, and she's really proud of everything that's happened, of course. My gran goes into the supermarket and makes sure all the labels are facing the front and turns the competitors around the wrong way. My parents for letting me cook jam in their kitchen for years on end, but probably the best help and support I had was from having a mentor, a guy called Kevin, who had started a successful business, and he was willing to spend some time with me, telling me lessons that he'd learned and sharing his advice. And I guess the last people that I need to thank are my amazing adventurers, Basque Culinary Center, for inviting me here today, all of you for very kindly giving me this chance to share my story. It's been a real honor. I look forward to meeting more of you later on, but until then, thank you.
Well, thank you, Fraser. Impressive project.
Thank you.
We have some 5 minutes time to a couple of questions, and after also we have more time, but please, Wonder.
A mí me gustaría saber cuál crees que es la clave del éxito de tu negocio, de tu mermelada, porque veo que hay bueno, no sé, como una dificultad fuerte que es la adicción que tiene el público en general al azúcar. Entonces, al hacer una mermelada que no lleva ningún edulcorante, entiendo yo, ni azúcar ni otra cosa, ¿cómo has conseguido eso? Y luego, si crees que igual la clave del éxito es que la gente cada vez está pensando en consumir productos menos nocivos para su salud, porque has hablado de una mermelada saludable. Gracias.
And also if the health thing, it's also part of the success.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes people say, like, what is the one thing that made this work? I guess, if I understood you correctly, I think that's what your question is. I think the thing about it is you have to get everything right. It wouldn't be enough to just have a product that tastes good but has terrible packaging. I think the whole journey of the supermarket saying no at different steps taught me that no matter how good the jam in the jar was, if it didn't look great, and if I didn't have a plan of how to market it, then it would never get put on the shelves, and nobody would ever take it off the shelves. So I think the idea of being 100% fruit was the idea that people buy into, but I also had to get the packaging right, and I had to figure out how to tell my story. So I think to make a success of a product, you have to get every aspect of it right. How do I see myself in 10 years' time? Seems like a very long way away to me. I don't really think very far ahead at all. Sometimes people think in life what you have to do is get a piece of paper and draw a picture of your perfect life in 20 years' time. And if you focus on that, then you'll get there. But I prefer to just be really open-minded about what might come along, and I try to just always do what I'm passionate about. And I figure if you get up every day and you do something you love, then you'll be successful and you'll be happy.
And last one, over there.
Hello, you said you had a mentor. What was the most valuable advice he or she gave you?
I think just having somebody to encourage me, but also I think when I was a kid, I would ask, my parents have never started a business or done anything like this, so they were very supportive, but they didn't know the answers to lots of questions about supermarkets and factories. And so I think having a mentor who could kind of answer those questions, but also who didn't have an emotional attachment to me, he could tell me things I didn't like to hear, or he could criticize me in a way that a parent probably couldn't. So I think it was good to have somebody who was independent, who could, if you have an idea and you say to your family and friends, is this a good idea? They'll say, yes, it's a great idea, because they don't want to hurt your feelings. So you have to find somebody who can kind of be critical of it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks very much.